Hey guys, Dr. J here again, and in this video we're going to be talking about several different topics that are going to be required for the Part 107 exam, the knowledge test. And one of those topics is going to be airspace. Now we're going to talk about airspace, different classes of airspace in a lot more detail in some other videos, but just wanted to give an overview in this one. So basically the way this works is that the FAA has designated certain parts of the airspace as a class. So Class B, Class C, Class D, Class E, you can see there's going to be a Class A airspace as well. Those classified or controlled airspace, that's what they're called, controlled airspace, you're not going to be able to operate your drones in that airspace unless you have prior authorization from air traffic control. Now, the regulation says air traffic control, but in reality, what this is going to mean is that we have, there's going to be an app. This is going to be through the FAA Drone Zone website or through different apps that you can use to get authorization, and it'll be somewhat of an automated process. Now, if you have to do something like fly at an actual airport, then that's going to be a whole separate authorization process. But for most of the time, as long as you're working within certain limitations that we'll talk about in more detail, you'll just need to fill out some information on an app or on a website, and that will allow you to fly in these areas, again, under certain circumstances. So, but in general, if you've got controlled airspace and uncontrolled airspace, and all these different classes that I've mentioned here are going to be controlled airspace, and you won't be able to fly there without this special authorization. So lots more on that to come. You're not going to be able to interfere, we've already talked about this a bit, with any other sort of airport operations. There'll also be a lot more on that to come. And you may not use a drone or a small unmanned aircraft in prohibited or restricted areas. So this is going to be things like airspace around a football stadium, airspace around a military facility. So these are going to be prohibited or restricted areas, and you won't be able to use that airspace without permission from the using or controlling agency, as whatever the case may be. And we'll talk a lot more about this. So we'll have a whole section on airspace and airspace classifications. This is just the general regulation. There's going to also be a number of temporary notices, temporary or permanent notices, and these are called notices to airmen. I think there's a new phrase, which is gender neutral, and I forget what that is. But these are called NOTAMs. So NOTAM is the short version. And there's going to be kind of a website to go and get information on these NOTAMs, and you'll need to check these NOTAMs before you go and do a flight. So as you're starting to see, there's going to be a bit of a process when you want to fly a drone under a Part 107 activity. You'll have to make sure that you're not in controlled airspace, and if you are, then you'll have to get the authorization, and then you'll have to check these NOTAMs, which are mostly temporary restrictions on flight. And this might be because maybe the president is driving through the area, and so there'll be a temporary restriction for that. There's a temporary restriction around stadiums within a certain period of time of large ball games, things like that. So again, we'll have more on this to come. There used to be a 5-mile rule around airports, and so this is important not because it's a rule anymore, it's not a rule anymore, but it's because people still think that it's a rule, that you have to be 5 miles away from airports. That's not a rule anymore. It's all about airspace. So you have to make sure that you understand what airspace that you're flying in, or if you need to fly in controlled airspace, how to get that authorization. And so we'll talk about that. And of course, the remote pilot in command, the RPIC, is responsible for doing all of this pre-flight activity. So prior to flying, the RPIC has to do all the normal things that you might think about, looking at the weather, but they also have to look at local airspace and temporary flight restrictions to make sure that they're flying legally. And of course, looking at hazards and people on the ground, etc. The remote pilot in command must also ensure that the persons directly participating in the operation are informed about all these things, including the potential hazards and any emergency procedures or contingency procedures that are going to happen. So this is going a little bit back to the RPIC responsibilities. You have to make sure that your control systems are working properly, and of course you'd want to do that anyway, and that there's enough power. Now, this issue about enough power is definitely an important one. If you don't have enough battery to complete a mission, the idea is that you need to stop the mission, come back, charge the battery again, or replace the battery, and then continue the mission. All right, how about operating limitations? So this is the common regulations for how to operate a drone. The RPIC, the remote pilot, needs to comply with these regulations. There is a speed limit for drones. 100 miles per hour is the speed limit. The ground speed should not exceed 100 miles per hour in the United States without a special waiver. The altitude, here's a big one. You may not fly more than 400 feet above ground level. Now, this is important. Above ground level does not mean 400 feet elevation, for example, above mean sea level. It's whatever the height of the ground is, 400 feet above that is how high you're able to fly. So here in this diagram, if you've got some hills and valleys, it's 400 feet above the ground level, all along this profile. So if you are taking off on a hill and then you're flying over the valley, you have to make sure that you're staying within this 400 feet elevation of the ground as you're flying along. So you have to kind of follow the terrain, basically, with this regulation. Not 400 feet above your launch site, it's 400 feet above the ground, which is underneath the drone. Just another diagram which sort of illustrates this. ASL is above sea level. You'll also see AMCL, above mean sea level. Here's our AGL, above ground level. And then this house here might be where you took off. That is above the origin point. And so you have to make sure, again, you're flying within 400 feet above ground level. Above ground level is the appropriate height to use when you're looking at the height of the drone for regulation. Okay, the other thing is that buildings actually count as ground, essentially. So let's say that you're flying an inspection for a tower. Now, of course, you have to think about safety here as well, but maybe you're flying an inspection for a tower or inspecting a building. You're actually able to fly 400 feet above that structure. So, and the specific regulation is if you're within a 400-foot radius of a structure, you can fly up to 400 feet higher than the structure's immediate uppermost limit. So I've got a little diagram here. There's a radius of 400 feet around this tower, and we're doing a tower inspection. The tower is 1,100 feet high above ground level. You're actually able to fly up to 1,500 feet maximum altitude above that structure. And so this is the FAA's regulation when you're doing these kinds of inspections. Flight visibility. The minimum flight visibility that you need is 3 statute miles. So if you can't see more than 3 statute miles visibility, you can't fly. And that means essentially, if there's fog, if there's bad weather, you're not going to be able to fly because you won't be able to see that far. There's also some regulations about clouds, actually. You don't want to fly into a cloud for sure. And the FAA has, again, specific regulations on this. You need to be outside 500 feet below the cloud and 2,000 feet horizontally. So here's what this looks like. Here's our little cloud, and we've got our UAV here. We need to be outside of this box, and the box is 500 feet below the cloud and has a horizontal radius of 2,000 feet. So the box is actually cut off. It would continue here off to the side, but we need to stay outside of this box. And so again, bad weather, clouds are low. You got to be very careful about not flying out into this restricted area. And again, this is all for safety purposes, so that, let's say, an airplane comes out of a cloud, which is flying above you. It may be close to the UAV if you were going to get closer than this. Remote ID is a new regulation by the FAA, which requires drones to have the capability of broadcasting information about themselves and about where they were, or about some information about location, where the drone took off from specifically. And this is part of the FAA's effort to integrate drones into the national airspace and doing that in a safe and secure way. And so Remote ID allows a party within radio contact to find the control station where the drone was launched. It also broadcasts, I think, the current location of the drone and the drone's serial number or some kind of identification number. So I think about this as essentially something for law enforcement. So law enforcement, there's been cases where drones have been flown in places where they are not allowed. For example, inside of a football stadium while a game was going on, or a baseball stadium. And so Remote ID allows law enforcement to receive that broadcast from the drone, identify the drone, and identify where it took off from, and basically find the person who's responsible for flying the drone in an unsafe manner. But it's essentially going to be eventually required of all drone manufacturers and all drone owners to make sure that their aircraft have Remote ID. And actually this quote here, it essentially says, again, what I was mentioning: authorized individuals from public safety organizations may request identity of the drone's owner from the FAA, so they will be able to get information about the identity of the drone and the location and altitude of the drone and its control station or takeoff location. So again, primarily a public safety official, a law enforcement kind of activities here. So the way that this works is that your drone needs to broadcast this information, the drone ID, location and altitude, velocity, control station, location and elevation, and some time and emergency status information. So this is going to be something which is changing fairly rapidly right now, but eventually all drones will probably be manufactured with a remote ID module. Some drones right now are out there which don't have these modules built in because the regulation just went into effect. And so if you have a drone which does not have a remote ID module already built in, you'll need to add a module, an external module, to your drone so that it has this. And this is going to be required basically right now. Now there are going to be exceptions, and the exception is a FAA recognized identification area. And this can be sponsored by a community-based organization or a school. And the idea here is that there'll be a limited area where anyone can fly their drone inside that area without having remote ID. Unfortunately, there's not really too many of these in existence at the moment, but there may be more as the regulation kind of comes into play. So all drone pilots who are required to register are also required to have remote ID. And beginning September 16th, 2023, this is when this goes into effect. I think they actually postponed it to October of 2023, but either way, right now this law is in effect. There is a whole controversy about privacy and about how this could be used. Anyone can pick up this, anyone with the proper frequency radio receiver can pick up this broadcast, not just law enforcement. And so there's a real concern with folks about privacy issues. And so there is some way of dealing with this. You can broadcast your drone serial number, or you can broadcast a session ID, although this is going to depend on what your manufacturer does and how they implement this. Okay, so this is something important. You need to be aware of it. It's going to be primarily an issue for drone manufacturers, but you need to make sure that if your drone does not have a remote ID module already built in, that you add a module to that. And there are companies that are making external modules that you can buy. All right, drone registration. All recreational drones that are larger than 0.55 pounds must be registered, and all other drones must be registered. So let me just clarify this, because this is a point of confusion that some people have. If your drone is less than 0.55 pounds, many people think you don't have to register it at all. That's only true if you are only using the drone for recreational purposes, flying for fun. If you're doing anything else, inspecting your crops as a farmer, flying, taking pictures at someone's wedding, doing volunteer work at an archaeological site, taking pictures or videos, doing anything other than just flying for fun, your drone needs to be registered no matter how much it weighs. So make sure that you are not flying an unregistered drone, because that won't be good if law enforcement or the FAA finds out. Now, we've been talking about the Part 107 knowledge exam. What do you actually need to be able to take that Part 107 knowledge exam? This is really cool, actually, because the Part 107 knowledge exam is open to many, many people. You have to be 16 years or older. You have to be able to read, speak, write, and understand the English language, because the test is only offered in English. And you can't have a known physical or mental condition that would interfere with the safe operation of a small unmanned aircraft system. And you have to demonstrate aeronautical knowledge, and the way that you do this is going to be the Part 107 knowledge exam. There's also a Part 61 pilot. If you're a Part 61 pilot license holder, then you can do some certain training and you can get the eligibility, get your certificate that way. But for most of you, you'll be taking the Part 107 knowledge exam, and if you pass it, then you can get a small UAS certificate, pilot certificate. The exam will consist of 60 questions to be completed in 120 minutes. You must achieve a score of 70% to pass, so that's 42 questions or more. After passing, you'll most likely receive a temporary certificate right away from the FAA, as in a few days, and that will be valid for 120 days. And you can fly with that certificate until your official certificate arrives, and that'll be by regular mail. Now, notice I didn't say anything here about being a U.S. citizen or a green card holder even. Actually, international students and people can take the Part 107 exam and get their small UAS certificate. So even if you're not a U.S. citizen, if you are able to speak and read and write English, then you can take the exam and get your certificate. Whoops. And anytime that you're flying a UAV, UAS, or a drone, you must have either taken that knowledge test, that Part 107 knowledge exam, or have done a recurrent training in the previous 24 months. So in other words, every 24 months you have to take a recurrent training. You see the link to the recurrent training here on the screen. The recurrent training is not difficult. It is online and it's free. So it's not anything that should keep you from keeping your certificate up to date. And if you do fail the test, you can actually reapply to take it again after just 14 days. So you can review the material that you missed and take the test again fairly quickly. If you change your address, the FAA needs to know. So you will have to give an address when you take the Part 107 exam, and you'll have to notify the FAA within 30 days of changing your address, and that can be done on the FAA's website if that happens.